In this video today, I'd like to talk about Python functions. Here's a piece of code we wrote previously. This piece of code calculates a factorial, right? You ask the user to input a number, you convert it to integer, and in a for loop, you calculate n factorial. And well, let's see if it works. It does, and it prints out the factorial. But let's imagine you have, in addition to what you've done, you have a following problem. Calculate, well, this is, I'll write it down. So calculate the first in terms of the following series. And the series would be sum of 1 over n factorial, right? From n equals 0 to n capital, right? Let's say you need to calculate that. So this calculation requires you calculate n factorial, right? So you probably want to use this piece of code you wrote previously. So in order to use the pieces of code written for other purposes, we often introduce functions. So in fact, even if you don't need, like in this example, even if you don't need to reuse this piece of code, you just want to split your code into more logical parts, you introduce functions as well. So it makes it easier to read the code, to modify it, to debug it. So when you be writing your code, you don't want to write it in as a single stream of instructions, but you'd rather split it in functions and then define them and call them in the program. So speaking about the syntax of the functions in Python, let me comment out this thing for now. Okay. Introduce a function. So when you introduce in a function, and let me call my function greeting, okay, you need to use the keyword definition, and then you introduce your name of a function similar to a name of variable. It can be whatever you want as long as it doesn't have spaces. Also, there are protected words in Python. You can't call your function for or if, or you can't call it def, and so on and so forth. And then you have the input variables here. So this function will greet user by name, right? So we define the function, and then we can say that all these function does is prints hello, and then name, and then the exclamation mark. Okay, if I run this code, it's not going to do anything. I mean, it's executed, it doesn't give me any error, but it doesn't in fact do anything, doesn't execute this function because we didn't call this function. First thing we need to do after we define it, we need to find a piece of code where we want to call the function. And for example, I can introduce name. It doesn't have to be the same name of the variable. You can call it, okay, let me call it my name, and it will be a string, Dr. Gore. All right, and then now if I call it, if I call my function, and Python already gives me a hint of the syntax of this function. So I can press enter and I get it, and then my name. Alright, now if I execute this piece of code, it will say, hello, Dr. Gore, because we called the function feeding as an input variable the string Dr. Gore. Alright, well, in fact, functions can have input variables, but there could be functions without any input. For example, I can introduce another function. Let me introduce it here, because actually we typically organize the code so that it starts from definitions of functions and then the code itself goes later. So let's call it universal greeting. And these, this function doesn't have any input variables. And what it prints hello, professor. So it doesn't call a user by the name. So now if I call this function, let me call it universal greeting. Okay. Let's see what it's going to give. I'll comment out this string so that it doesn't confuse you and run this piece of code. Alright, it says hello professor. We didn't provide the name for the variable and it just prints this default line. You don't really need to define a function which does such a silly thing. However, if you want to, you know, that's a simple example. Well, by the way, on a sort of side note, when you write emails to professors, it's better to use personalized greetings rather than saying hello professor. But that has nothing to do with Python. All right. In addition to having input variables or input parameters, a function can have output parameters or output variable. It can return some value, and here's how it is done. Let's introduce another function and call it greeting1. Okay, and let it have a name as a input variable, and let's introduce a string whatever, grtn, which will say hello name and exclamation mark. Okay, I actually don't need this extra space here. I think the syntax will add a space in between. Okay, and then if I want this function to return something, and in particular this string to me, I say return and then the name of this variable I want to return. Alright, so let me comment out this line and then call this new function. Okay, greeting1 and my name. Okay, so if I run it, well, it doesn't print anything. It returned the value, but we didn't ask it to print the value. So now I can say print and then greeting1. So this thing will be a string which it returns, and the print function should give us an output for this string. Alright, so in fact, I know what I did. So it interpreted it as a tuple because I added comma here. So I need to concatenate my strings here so that it will be one string. Oh, it's actually a nice example confusing the types. Okay, hello, Dr. Gore. That looks a little bit better. All right,